Hey guys, welcome to another video for biology. In this video, we're going to talk about light-dependent reactions. This video will be building off of the very first recording I did on YouTube, where I talk about Photosystem 2 and Photosystem 1. So we'll be talking about those same systems here, but we'll be adding more detail to this process. And we're talking about the law of thermodynamics, where we're discussing the transfer of energy from the sun to a glucose molecule in the plant. So when I talk about the transfer of energy in a plant, we're essentially talking about two main phases. This first phase is called light-dependent reactions. So as you can see, we're going to be talking about a process that requires sunlight. And this process begins in the chloroplast, which is located inside the cell. Oh, actually, let me go back real quick. So as I mentioned before, two main processes, right? Two main phases. First one is light-dependent, and then the second does not require light, the Calvin cycle. So let's dive into where this is happening. This is happening in every single leaf of the plant in the chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast, we have what's called thylakoids. These thylakoids in this particular image, you can see they kind of look like watch batteries, right? You know, the circular batteries that you put in your watch. And as you can see, they're kind of stacked on each other. And each one of those stacks we call a granum, right? So you'll see here that these thylakoids are the innermost part of the chloroplast, which have two layers to it. You have an outer membrane and an inner membrane. And then the part that gives this chloroplast its shape is the liquid fluid inside, called the stroma. The stroma surrounds all of the thylakoids, all those stacks of pancakes, if you will. And if you notice that we have two stacks here. One stack has a quarter cut, and one has a half cut. And then you have this pink membrane inside, this pink space inside. That's the thylakoid space. And this is where the light reactions occurs. It occurs on the membrane of the thylakoid. So let's talk about this thylakoid. So here's a granum. We're going to take a couple of those granum. We're going to slice a piece of it off, and you'll notice that. So you have the lighter green, the stroma, the outside, the liquid, the outside fluid, and then you have the thylakoid space on the inside. And then you have this membrane that creates a border between the outside and the inside. And this is where the magic happens. This is where we're going to highlight that membrane here is a phospholipid bilayer, just like the human cell has. And that divides the stroma, the liquid, from the thylakoid, the space inside. So, like the human phospholipid bilayer, the plant phospholipid bilayer, the thylakoid membrane, has molecules, has proteins embedded inside that create all these reactions that we're going to talk about. So we're going to zoom in a little bit on Photosystem 2 and Photosystem 1, just like we did in the very first video that I recorded. So let's zoom in. So you have Photosystem 1 and Photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 is first because it was discovered first, and Photosystem 1 because it was discovered second. So in any case, there are two photosystems. And then we have what's called the electron transport chain. Okay, so it's kind of like a ladder of proteins that leads from Photosystem 2, which was discovered first, down to Photosystem 1. And then finally we have ferredoxin, a molecule that I'll explain what it is later. But that will be the final step to this process. And then we have our electrons, which I have starred, the blue representing low energy, and the pink or the orange gold represents high energy, excited electrons. So let's dive into this process. So we have sunlight that comes down from the sun, and then you have a water molecule waiting for it in Photosystem 2. That water molecule absorbs that sunlight. The electrons absorb that sunlight energy, and that electron becomes unstable. And as that electron becomes unstable, it breaks apart water and oxygen, and then it releases oxygen, which we breathe in, and then it releases the hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, or the stroma. So that high energy electron goes into the reaction center, and then that electron will go through the electron transport chain, then to Photosystem 1, and then finally ferredoxin. In the process of doing this, it's going to be losing the energy that it has stored. So let's talk about that first part here. So as you can see, so before I continue, there are two things that are going to happen simultaneously here. I'm going to talk about the first one first. So imagine this electron here, kind of like a person at the top of a ladder, right? The person at the top of a ladder is in an unstable state, and all they want to do is walk down. As they walk down, they become more stable, and they release energy. So this electron is walking down that electron transport chain, and it's going to hand over some of its energy to that ADP molecule, and then it will turn it into an ATP molecule. ATP molecule is the unstable version of ADP. So now this ATP molecule has some of that energy from the sun stored in it, and it's going to go down to the Calvin cycle to transfer that energy over to a glucose molecule. So let's take a step back and talk about the second thing that happens. The second thing, and probably the most important thing, is that as this electron goes down this electron transport chain, it pumps these molecules, these molecules in between the two photosystems, pump hydrogen ions into the thylakoid space, right? So let's zoom out a little bit so you can see this happening again. So these hydrogen ions that were in the stroma will get pumped into the thylakoid space, right? Now we'll zoom out a little bit more so you can see what's happening again. So as these hydrogen ions build up inside the thylakoid space, you create what's called a pressure gradient or an electrochemical gradient. And that pressure gradient acts kind of like a water hose. You know, in a water hose where you put that spray mechanism on it, you turn on the water hose and the water gets to that mechanism and it stops until you press the lever and release that pressure to wash your car or to water your plants. So the water pressure hits that mechanism. So on the water hose side, there is a pressure gradient. There's a buildup of pressure that wants to get released. And on the opposite side of that water hose of the mechanism, there's less pressure, so that's why the water will go out in the outward direction. Likewise here, we have a pressure gradient in the thylakoid space, and it wants to get released. And it will do so through a molecule called Atp Synthase, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later on in the video. So in the meantime, let's come back to our photosystems. So photosystem 2, the electron goes down, and as it goes down the ladder, right, it loses energy. Let me take a step back. The energy that was gained from the sun, most of that energy gets transferred in this pressure gradient. So this pressure gradient is stored energy, kind of like with the water hose. The water shoots up to the mechanism and it stops. And that energy is just waiting. That potential energy is just waiting to be released. And then when you squeeze the lever, the trigger, it shoots the water out and the energy is being released, right? It gets transferred out. Likewise here, most of the energy from the sun is transferred into that pressure gradient. And then the electron has lost its energy. Now it's in a more stable state. And now in photosystem 1, more beams of sunlight will come in. It absorbs more sun, okay? And then it goes into the photosystem reaction center. And then those high energy electrons get transferred to another molecule called NADP. NADP is stable. It's fine. But when you have those electrons present and then you have a hydrogen ion present, so these electrons provide an electrical bond between hydrogen and NADP. So now NADP is now NADPH, which is unstable because of those high energy electrons. And so now NADP will act as a transfer molecule, just like ADP, right? ADP grabs energy, turns into ATP, and now it becomes a transfer molecule to take to the Calvin cycle to be stored in a glucose molecule. So recall that we have been talking about the transfer of energy. The plant in the thylakoid membrane absorbs the energy from the sun, transfers it to electrons, and the electrons transfer it or hop onto these electron transport molecules, and they take them to the Calvin cycle, where then they will be transferred again into glucose. So law of thermodynamics playing out here, right? And as I mentioned before, so here's the overview here. So notice the light-dependent reactions absorb energy, transfer it to ATP and NADPH, and then they transfer it to the Calvin cycle, which will then make sugars. And then those transfer molecules that were excited become more stable, become NADP and ADP, and they go back to the light-dependent reactions to gain more energy, and they just keep cycling through all day long as there's sun and water, right? Water is also necessary because water provides those electrons for the transfer of energy. Again, this is why plants need water. right? Plants need water because they provide electrons, and plants need sun because that's the energy they absorb to transfer over to glucose. And then as they keep doing this all day long, they keep adding more glucose molecules. It's like a house. You keep adding more bricks, the house will naturally get bigger. Well, in a plant, you keep adding more glucose molecules, the plant naturally gets bigger. All right, so let's go back to that pressure gradient. So most of the energy from the sunlight is in this pressure gradient. And this molecule ATP synthase, which I will make a separate video for where I go into greater detail as to how it actually works. This molecule acts kind of like a turbine, right? It acts like a turbine that, if you picture a waterfall, the running water turns the turbine, which then turns the magnet and coil, which produces electricity, right? So the energy of the falling water is transferred to a turbine, and the turbine transfers the energy into electricity, which we use to light our rooms and houses and whatever, right? So likewise, this ATP synthase will take that flow of hydrogen ions, that pressure gradient, and it will release it. And as the turbine, as the rotor, as it's like a little engine that rotates, think of a boat as the engine rotates on the rotor, okay? As the engine rotates, it turns a blade, which then propels the boat, right? It's the same thing. It's the exact same thing. It's really cool, but at a nanoscale, super, super small. So ADP is combined with a phosphate to make ATP, right? So most of and you'll notice that here we are producing a lot more ATP molecules than we did in our photosystems. Our photosystem produced one ATP and one NADPH, which is good. But most of the energy or most of the ATP molecules is made via this pressure gradient. Okay? So in summary, we have low energy molecules that are lonely, if you will, and they want more energy. They want to get more excited. So then they take in the energy from the sun, from the photosystems, and the pressure gradient. They take this energy, restore it, and now they are going to transfer that energy to the Calvin cycle, where then the Calvin cycle will transfer the energy from these molecules into sugar molecules, glucose molecules. So in my next video, I'm going to highlight the ATP synthase, and I will discuss the actual mechanism, the inner workings, the recipe, if you will, of how ATP is created from ADP and a phosphate group. Okay, well, I hope this helped. Again, this is going off of my very first recording, but adding more information. So this was photosynthesis, light-dependent reactions. I hope this helped, and good luck in your studying.